Hi, page turners. Welcome back. I'm Katja, also known as Kat, and today I am sharing with you my suggestions for prompt number 2 for the Women in Translation read along. And this is a series of videos to help you complete the read along. I'm dedicating one video to each prompt, so hopefully you'll come away with one or perhaps a few books that you'd love to add to your TBR. I've also linked to my co hosts' channels in the description below because between the three of us, Roz, Angelia, and me, I think we've ended up with a really varied set of recommendations. The first prompt was to read a woman author from a continent other than your own, and I've linked my video for that in the description. If you watched it, you'll know that every recommendation came from books I'd personally read and loved. Whereas prompt number 2 is a little different. This challenge is to read a translated genre book by a woman. A genre novel being a fiction book written in a specific established category like romance, science fiction, fantasy, crime, mystery, all of that. And last time I focused on the recommending of what I knew, and this time it's going to be more a curated wish list and a pile of possibilities rather than personal recommendations. I think this prompt made me realize that despite being an eclectic reader, my translated fiction has actually surprisingly concentrated on cozy fiction, literary fiction, and slice of life stories, with the occasional speculative novel mixed in. And sometimes I've read Japanese crime fiction over the years, but almost all of those authors have been men. So I think this prompt showed that I had some obvious gaps in my translated fiction reading. If you're in a similar position, perhaps we can use this prompt as an excuse to discover something completely new together. First up, fantasy, a genre that I am well familiar with, and yet I struggled. Since almost every translated work that I thought of, things that came to mind were written by men, or in the case of Vita Nostra, by a husband and wife duo, I think the women that I thought of as authors for fantasy were also those that fell into middle grade and young adult categories. So I had to look at my list of books that I've got written out on a physical TBR, and I found two. The first is The Grey House by Mariam Petrosyan, and originally written in Russian by the Armenian author, it was translated by Yuri Machkusov. And it's set in a mysterious boarding school where every room, corridor, and student seems to operate according to its own strange rules. And rather than it being a fast moving plot, it seems to be more an atmospheric novel exploring identity, disability, and belonging through the shifting perspectives of its teenage residents. And I had a quick look at some reviews, and it seems that the house itself becomes a character bending time and reality. As graduation approaches, the students have to confront the prospect of leaving this extraordinary place behind and entering the ordinary world. So it sounds wonderfully strange and definitely one that I can understand why I put it on the TBR. Another fantasy that I had on my TBR, but this time I actually own and it's been sitting on my e reader, is Culpa Imperial, The Greatest Empire That Never Was by Angelica Goredischer, and translated from the Spanish by Ursula K. Le Guin. I actually bought it way back in 2024 for whatever reason, never reached for it. So perhaps Women in Translation Month is finally the excuse that I need to focus on it. And rather than one central hero or storyline, it's a collection of interconnected tales about an imaginary empire, its rulers, its ordinary people, its ups and downs, triumphs and failures, and is described as a tapestry of myth, folklore, and fantasy. The more I consider it, the more I was wondering why I've left it unread on my Kindle for so long, especially as the author is regarded as one of Argentina's great speculative fiction writers. So I do think this is a high probability of me reading this for this prompt, if that makes sense. Now, science fiction was probably the hardest category to narrow down because there are actually a lot of choices, modern choices by women writing in translation. So the first I'd mention is On the Calculation of Volume by Solvi Bale, and that is translated from the Danish by Barbara J. Haviland. This acclaimed series follows Tara Selter, an antiquarian bookseller who finds herself trapped reliving the 18th of November over and over again. And it's a familiar idea of a time loop, but it slows it right down, becoming this thoughtful meditation on time, memory, and solitude, and what it means to inhabit the same day forever. And I read the first volume when it was shortlisted for the International Booker last year, and I really want to read the others. It is not fast paced, not like the time loop stories I was used to in the past, but it is nonetheless fascinating. Next is The Core of the Sun by Johanna Sinisalo, translated from the Finnish by Lola Rogers, and it is set in the 21st century in Finland as a dystopian novel where the government controls reproduction through a rigid eugenics program, dividing women into categories based on how useful they are to society. And the main character's sister disappears. So the main character finds herself drawn into an underground world where a special type of chili pepper has become contraband and all sorts of other stuff. So it seems equal parts dystopian fiction, satire, and social commentary. Next in line is The Queue by Basma Abdel Aziz, translated from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jacquet. And it follows a failed uprising. Citizens must obtain permission from a mysterious authority known simply as the gate before they can carry out even the most ordinary parts of daily life after this failed uprising. And one man, Yeya, desperately needs surgery after being wounded through a protest that happened, and the authorities claim that nobody was ever shot. So it sounds like a powerful exploration of bureaucracy, propaganda, authoritarianism, and also I've seen a lot of comparisons with Orwell's 1984. Another book that's been high on my TBR for quite a while is Amatka by Karen Tidbeck, which the author translated herself from Swedish. The story follows Vanya, who is sent to a remote colony on what seems like an ordinary work assignment. At first, it resembles a familiar dystopian society, but the central idea is quite original. Reality itself is sustained by language. Objects continue to exist as long as we label them, stop naming them, and they literally begin to fall apart. It's one of those concepts that makes me want to know how the author builds an entire society around this single idea. Moving on to mystery. The Aosawa Murders by Riko Onda, translated from the Japanese by Alison Watts. This novel begins with a mass poisoning at a birthday party where most of the guests die, but one young girl survives. So it's like a puzzle piece because decades later, no one really knows what happened and they want to figure it out. So rather than following a detective in the traditional sense, the story unfolds through interviews, memories, and conflicting accounts, gradually asking the reader to piece together the truth for themselves. So I think, as someone who enjoys Japanese crime fiction, this sounds like a mystery that's less about just catching the culprit, but also exploring memory, perspective, and the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think, yeah, it would be fascinating to read. Then we have a thriller. I've had Out by Natsuo Kirino, translated from Japanese by Stephen Snyder, sitting on my TBR since 2018. So I might read two books at this point because I feel like I really need to reduce my TBR, my owned TBR. And this one's been recommended to me so many times that I really don't have much of an excuse as to why I'm not reading it. The novel follows four women working the night shift in a factory who become involved in covering up a murder. From there, everything begins to spiral, and I've heard people describe it as tense, morally complex, and surprisingly compassionate despite its very dark premise. And it's often mentioned as one of the modern classics of Japanese crime fiction. So, yeah, this is definitely an opportunity for me to reduce my owned TBR. Historical fiction. I'm considering The Waiting Years by Fumiko Enchi, translated from Japanese by John Bester. It's on my general TBR list. I don't own it yet, but I listed it a while back because Roz had recommended it. And even if I don't read it for Women in Translation Month, it's one I'm generally aware I will be reading eventually. Enchi is widely regarded as one of Japan's great 20th century writers, and this novel is set in the 19th century following Tomo, the dutiful wife of a wealthy government official who is instructed by her husband to choose a young concubine for him. And from everything I've heard, that's really just the beginning of a much larger story about duty, sacrifice, and the limited options available to women at that time and in that place. And then we move on to a genre I hardly ever read, and yet surprisingly really enjoyed when I did read it for Reading the Globe and our chosen book at the time. So this is Jawbone by Monica Ojeda. And it's one that I've seen recommended again and again by readers whose tastes usually align with mine, but they're obviously far more into horror than I am. And it is said to be psychological, unsettling, and explores adolescence, obsession, faith, and fear in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable rather than conventionally frightening. So I suppose that is something that I like, that it's not conventionally frightening. From everything I've heard, this isn't a novel built around jump scares and monsters. It's more a horror that builds up gradually under your skin and stays with you long after you finished. So yeah, I have to admit it's probably one of the lowest on my list, but if you're into horror, then that is a well recommended or regarded book. Then we have middle grade and young adult, and these two I've actually read, so I can recommend them wholeheartedly. I read them, loved them, and the first is Kiki's Delivery Service by Aiko Kadona and translated from Japanese by Emily Balistrieri. Most people know this from the Studio Ghibli book film, but it was a novel long before and follows 13-year-old Kiki as she leaves home with her black cat Gigi, and they spend a year training in a new town. Since flying is her only real skill as a witch, she starts a delivery service, and the novel follows her small, everyday adventures as she gradually finds her place in the community. At its heart, it's a coming of age story about independence, confidence, and discovering where you belong. But I feel as an adult, it really taught me a lot about burnout. So it is surprisingly layered and yet extremely comforting. So if you're looking for something gentle and comforting during Women in Translation Month, I don't think you can go wrong with this one, and maybe team it up with watching the Studio Ghibli. Anyway, the second recommendation I have is Moomin Papa at Sea by Tove Jansson and translated by Kingsley Hart. So although it's often shelved as children's literature, the Moomin books have always spoken powerfully to adults. And I think this one especially. The Moomin family moves to a remote island in search of a new beginning. But what follows is a surprisingly thoughtful novel about loneliness, purpose, family, and learning how to live with uncertainty. Moomin Papa is quietly wrestling with a midlife crisis. Moomin Mama feels disconnected from her surroundings, and each family member responds differently to the isolation of island life. It's one of those rare books that you read when you're younger, and then it just becomes richer and more in depth the older you are, and when you read it and get more context. Finally, we have The Iliad Crest by Cristina Rivera Garza and translated from the Spanish by Sarah Booker. I'm tempted to say it's speculative fiction, but it also sounds like gothic fiction, psychological horror, and literary mystery. So the novel follows an unnamed doctor whose sense of identity begins to unravel after the arrival of two mysterious women. And it becomes an exploration of gender, disappearance, and the stories we tell ourselves. Those are the books and genres that immediately came to mind, and in some cases required me to look at my TBR, but they are by no means exhaustive. In particular, I'd love more mystery recommendations by women, more fantasy recommendations, and any genres I haven't touched on. One of my favorite things about these community read alongs is that the comment sections in our videos also become a fantastic list of recommendations in their own right. So please do share your favorites. And that's it. Unlike my previous video, these are more a pile of possibilities rather than well known personal favorites, and I genuinely love your input. Let me know if you've read any of these, which would you recommend first, and are there any translated books by women in these genres and others that you think deserve far more attention? I'll be back very soon with suggestions for prompt number 3, where we'll be looking at translated works that aren't novels, so nonfiction, short stories, all of that poetry. There are some really interesting possibilities for that one, so I hope you'll join me. As always, thank you so much for watching. Happy reading, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.